Hey, how's it going? It's Lee Halliday, and in this video we are going to be learning all about colocating fragments. This has to do with when you're making a GraphQL query, but you've sort of got a whole bunch of different components that are using different pieces of the data from your query. You can basically take parts of those query and colocate them with the components that actually use that data. So this is the query we're working with. It's from the GraphQL API. And basically I'm asking for the details about a repository that I own. So owner is Lee Halliday. The name is used supercluster. And I'm just asking for a few fields: ID, name, description, along with the first 5 languages that are used in this project. Looks like there's only 2, HTML and TypeScript, but that's fine. So when I run this, I get the results, basically an array of the languages back plus this info. So let's take this query and build it into a Create React app, basically from scratch using Apollo Boost. So I've got a Create React app running. It's got nothing going on right now except an app that says GraphQL and a div, so pretty simple. I've already pre-installed the libraries we're going to use. I'll post this repo, so you don't need to memorize any of this stuff, but we're using Apollo with React hooks, Apollo Boost to make it a little bit easier to set Apollo up, and GraphQL Anywhere to filter out some data as we pass that down from the parent to the child that will be asking for a fragment or a portion of all the data. So let's get started. Whenever you're dealing with GraphQL, you want to create a client. That is how it knows sort of what API endpoint to connect to and any headers you need to pass along to it. So we are going to import Apollo Client from Apollo Boost. And then we'll just create a new instance of this. So const client equals new Apollo Client. And you pass in some options. So the first option is the URI. That's where this thing lives. So we'll just copy this from graphical in a string. And then we're going to pass some headers along too. GitHub requires you to authenticate. So we are going to use the authorization header and bearer along with the value of my token here. So I already have this in my graphical setup, so I'll copy that over and paste that in. If you want to know how to get this token, you basically go into your GitHub settings, developer settings, personal access tokens, and you can create a new token. I'll be security first, deleting this one after this video is done. So even if you steal it, it's not going to do anything. All right, so back to here, back to the code. We've got our client. We are going to export this as default. Export default client. And now we come back to the app and we are going to import the client from that file we just created. But we're not there yet. We basically need to provide a context so that any of our children components can create queries and access this client. And we do that with a provider. So I'm going to import Apollo provider from, and it's from Apollo React hooks. So what you do is you take this, and we can actually get rid of this div here. We're not actually using it. So we'll wrap this around what will be our whole application, and we need to give it the client. So now any child of Apollo provider here will be able to make GraphQL queries. So we are going to, why don't we start it off in the same file and then we'll eventually move it to its own. So we're going to create a component called repository. And it's going to receive the name and the owner of the repository query. And right now, why don't we just have a div that says repo here. So it's not really doing anything yet, but that will allow us to come in here and embed it as a child of the Apollo provider. So we'll pass in the name, that would be mine, and sorry, the owner is me, and the name is the name of the repo, so it was used supercluster, just like that. So if I come back to the browser, I'm now seeing repo. That's the this repository spitting out a div repo. So at this point, we're actually going to break this out into its own file to keep things a bit organized. So we'll call this the repository. .js. We'll import React from React, and we will export repository, just like that. Mess something up. There we go. So now I can come back to app and import that. So import repository from repository, and we should be back in business. So moving forward, why don't we actually try to make a query to the GraphQL API? I'm going to go back to graphical, and for now I'm just going to copy this whole query. We're not going to break it up yet and introduce the concept of fragments. We're going to get things working simply first. So we'll come into our code and we'll go to our repository component. Remember, it's receiving the owner and the name. And the first thing we want to do is we want to define a query. So we'll have to import GQL, GraphQL, I don't know actually what it stands for. GraphQL, I guess? I don't know. Doesn't matter. And this comes from Apollo React hooks, I believe. If not, we will figure that out shortly. Looks like it is. Perfect. Okay, so we will define our query. So we'll call this repository query, and that is GQL, and you use the backticks, and we'll paste in this query here. Now, we'll get this working first just with hard-coded values here, but eventually I'll switch that up to use variables so we can make it a bit more dynamic. So what we want to do is, first of all, I actually don't think GQL, we'll see. We want to import useQuery. This is a hook from Apollo React hooks that will allow us to make a query and get a response back, whether it's loading and all that stuff. So what this returns us is data, loading, and whether there's an error. So use query. The first thing you pass in is the query itself, and then we can pass in some other things such as variables that we want to pass to the query. So we'll just set up a few checks here. If error, we will return a div that just says error. Not so user-friendly, but that's okay. So if it's loading or there is not data, whatever reason there's no data yet, we will return a div that says loading ... So if we get to this point, that means we must have data. There's no error, it's not loading anymore. So why don't we just make sure it's actually working? So we will embed json.stringify to give us a look at the response. So we'll pass in data. We're not going to use a replacer, but we'll pass in 2 as the number of spaces to indent to make it look nice. And here's a trick. We'll wrap this in a pre so that we can actually see the line breaks and the spacing. So if we come back here, I knew it. GQL is not from Apollo React hooks. Where is it from? Import GQL from Apollo Boost. Let's try that. Excellent. Okay, so just to reiterate, GQL is from Apollo Boost, not from hooks, like I so badly made that mistake before. Okay, but it is working. If I refresh, it's loading for like a split second, and then we're using this nice pre to output the response, keeping the spacing and all of that from the json.stringify. But here you can see we are getting our full result. The ID name plus the languages and the array of those. So we're good to keep going. Why don't we make this dynamic first? So what I mean by that is we're going to pass in an object, which are the query hook options. We'll pass in variables, and we'll pass in the owner and the name as variables. That on its own is not good enough. We first need to come up here and basically tell GraphQL that it's going to be receiving variables. So we do that by saying query, and you can only use variables on named queries, so we have to give it a name. We'll call it the repository query. And here we define what variables we'll be receiving. So we're receiving owner, which is a string, required value, and a name, which is also a required string like that. And next thing is we can take that $owner variable, come down here and replace this hard-coded value there and there, and it's still working. So because we've done that, we've made it dynamic, we could actually come back here and we could have two of them. So we could do another package I have uses .tools, and now we're showing both of these here. So that one uses JavaScript and TypeScript, and this one HTML and TypeScript. So our app is coming, I guess, together. It's not doing too much right now, but why don't we start to display the data? And what we're going to do is basically break this languages part into its own child component to clean up the code, because this would eventually start to get big and we want to break our components into smaller chunks. So why don't we just keep this for now, just in case we ever want to take a peek at what the data looks like, and instead we'll return a div, and this div will have an h2 in it that shows the data.repository.name. So here we're seeing the two names. And why don't we have a new component which doesn't yet exist called languages. And languages will receive the repository, so data.repository, and it will be in charge of rendering out the languages that it receives. So it's going to freak out for a bit because it's not defined. So we will preemptively import this thing from a file that doesn't exist, but let's go create that. So new file, languages.js, we'll import React, and we will create our languages function, functional component that will receive the repository. And its job is going to be to return out and showing all of the languages. So maybe we'll put them in an unordered list and we'll loop through them all. So that would be repository.languages. Where's the array? What? Just because I forget, I'm going to see. Actually, I could look at graphical, right? So nodes is the array. Perfect. Okay, so repository.languages.nodes, and we map those, so each one is a language. And it will render an li, and the li will have the language name. But we have to add our key here, remember, so that will be the language.id. And then we just need to export correctly. So I believe if I didn't mess this up, it should be showing things correctly now. Perfect. So we got the H2 showing the name of the repo, plus a list showing the languages used within it. So now we're going to move into sort of the whole point of this video to begin with, using collocated fragments. So here you've got basically a languages component. It doesn't know really where it's getting its data from. It's receiving way more data than it actually needs. For example, it's getting access to the name and the ID of the repository. We don't actually need that, we just need the languages. But we have another issue here in repository where it's having to query a whole bunch of data that it doesn't actually use itself. So the idea is, what if we could take this part of the query and co-locate it with the component that actually uses it? So that's what we will do. We will first start by just copying out this part of the query. So we'll come down to just below the function. And I didn't know you could do this, but you can actually add additional properties to this function. So we're going to create one called fragments. And fragments will be an object. And this object will have an attribute called repository on it. I actually don't need this yet. So first things first, I need to define the fragment itself. This is like a part of a query. So because we're working with the GraphQL Query language, that's what GQL stands for, GraphQL Query language. Nice. So we'll import that from Apollo Boost again, and we need to define our fragment. It's a portion, it's some fields basically from the repository. Reusable, you could reuse it in a bunch of places. I guess that's what reusable means. Anyways, we've got our, what are we doing? Language fragment, and that is GQL. So here we are saying it's a fragment called language fragment, and you need to tell it what type this fragment is meant to be used on. So this is being used on the repository type. The way you would know that is if you were to come down, and you could probably just hover here, you can see that this is a type of the type is repository. And then we basically just paste in the fragment, the portion of the query that we want to use here. So now I can come back down and finish up attaching fragments to languages. So the repository fragment would be the language fragment, like this. So by doing this, we can basically go back up to its parent, and because we're already importing this, we're able to access the fragments that this component is exposing to us. So what we're going to do is we're going to basically cut out this portion, and we're going to say ... language fragment. This is basically take this fragment and embed it into the query here. Expand what it's asking for inside of the repository query. But we also have to pass the actual fragment itself in. Otherwise, it doesn't know what this language fragment thing is. So we can access languages, which is the component we imported, .fragments, .repository. Just like that. And we can come back here and everything is still working. So it's a little bit better, I would say. The query here is only asking for sort of what it's using right here. I'm actually not using the description, but why don't we throw this in just for fun? Data.repository.description. Okay, beautiful. This one doesn't have one, I guess. We're only asking for the fields we're actually going to use, and then we're just embedding fragments that our other child components are asking for. So you can imagine maybe there's 50 fields that are being used on the repository, all split out amongst different components. Here we can just take in their fragments and include that in the query. But there's still one sort of issue, is that we're still passing all of the data down to languages, even data that languages isn't asking for and isn't using. So there is a function we can import called filter, and it comes from GraphQL Anywhere. And what filter allows you to do is basically take all of the data and filter it down just to what matches the fragment. So what we'll do is we'll come here and we'll use the filter here. So we'll pass in the filter. The first thing we pass this function is the fragment itself, so languages.fragments.repository. And then we pass in the data that we want to filter. So that would be data.repository. Just like that. So it's still working great, but why don't we go take a look at the repository data that's actually being passed to languages. So if I were to just put an additional return above, we'll use this pre technique where we embed json.stringify the repository, no replacer, 2 spaces. So now you can see we're not passing down the ID, the name, the description. We're just receiving the exact data that this component asked for, which is really powerful. It's powerful because not just is it only receiving what it actually needs, but if you were using TypeScript and automatically generating types based on your Apollo queries and fragments included, you could create a type. Well, it would be created automatically, and I have another video for that I'll link below if you're interested in how that works. But you could basically type here, the exact data that this is going to receive, just limited to the fragment that's providing the data for this component. So if I just get this working again, why don't we quickly just cover what we looked at today. So we started with a full-on query asking for a whole bunch of repository info. Not a whole bunch, like 5 fields. First thing he did was we set up an Apollo client. That client is necessary to be able to connect to GraphQL. We pass that client to the Apollo provider that wraps around everything else that's going to query for data or make mutations or all of that stuff. And what we did was embedded 2 repository components that were showing some details about different repos that I own. So in repository, what we did was we set up our query where it was receiving some dynamic data, so some data via variables, and we're asking for a repository that matches the variable values it receives, but we're only asking for fields here that are being used directly in this component here, and we're embedding fragments that are being asked for by other components that are children to this one. So if we sort of skip making the query itself, passing in the variables, handling error state, loading state, etc., we've got this languages component. Languages component is asking for a fragment, so a portion of a query, a reusable part on the repository. And it's only expecting to receive just the data that it's asking for. And we basically attached this fragment and included it in the export. That allowed us to basically embed this here and also passing in and embedding the fragment here. And then instead of passing down all of the data to the child, we used this filter function from GraphQL Anywhere to basically filter out only what was included in the fragment itself, which helped a lot when you're dealing with TypeScript, so you can add the correct type here for exactly the data that this component should be receiving. That's it for this video today. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll share the link to the source code below. Let me know what else you would like to see. Subscribe if you enjoyed this. Take care and have a good day. Bye.